has been very active lately writing a novel, and it's historical. It goes back to the 1700s, and it's going to be a lot like A River Runs Through It, and that's kind of the vision he has. And so he's excited about that. But let's back up a little bit and realize his background before coming to our meeting here. He has 2 master's degrees. He has 10 published books by traditional publishers. He's spoken at over 100 conferences and been keynote speaker at 30. He's taught English and communication skills, the speech side, with regard to Azusa Pacific, and he's been at Hope International and also Oxnard College. More importantly, he paid his dues. Let's just say he also worked at the high school level for 11 years. So he's got background there. He is a contributor to the Artist's View, and he's a panelist there. And he's got a blog, you might want to look it up after our meeting today, called Unconventional, that has 12,000 visitors a year. So he's active, he's got a platform, and he's involved in outreach in the business world of writing. And so he's knowledgeable and comes to us with a lot of experience and background. So Tim, take it away, please.
Thank you, Dennis. Am I on speaker view now? Everything's good? Okay. I appreciate you guys asking me to be here, and I'm kind of amazed. I've never seen a group as organized and competent as you guys are. I mean that. A lot of writers are kind of wannabes, that they're hoping to get there, but it's nice to be with a group. And honestly, I feel a little bit intimidated, and I hope what I've got to share will help and bless you guys and challenge you a little bit. So one of the things that Dennis talked about in the preview was how hard writing leads to easier reading. I've spent time in jail, not in jail. I've been threatened with lawsuits. I've rappelled off a 190-foot bridge tower and a 110-foot rope, but nothing matches the difficulty and fear that writing brings. And I think a lot of people do it on a surface that they want to write what they want to write. But I heard at one of my first writing conferences, we write for one of 2 reasons: for therapy or impact. And if we're writing for therapy to kind of feel good about us and process our stuff, then we can do whatever we want with writing. But if we want to go for impact, then we need to be aware of the audience, how we're presenting it, and develop the craft of writing. You know, I'm intrigued. I've written 10 books. All of them so far have been nonfiction. Most of what I learned with writing came from reading primarily fiction. Like Dennis mentioned, this is my very first novel, and it's a totally different animal. But there's some principles of excellent writing I think apply to all of them. I'll mention these a little bit later, but 2 books I think are delightfully written and will encompass the things we're talking about. If you haven't not read the book yet, A River Runs Through It, or The Great Gatsby. They are a couple of the best written with the craft that I've ever seen. They know the rules, they break them. And if you haven't seen Finding Forrester, that's another one that's a phenomenal insight into the writing process. There was a guy at a conference I taught a couple of years ago, and he really struggled. He wanted to write more for therapy, but he wanted to impact people as well. We battled with that, and he came up with a line that I like. It's easy reading results from hard writing. Easy reading results from hard writing. The more work we put into it, of both opening ourselves up, of making sure we know the craft, the better the impact we're apt to have. Robert Heinlein was one of my favorites. I didn't realize the worldview he presented with a lot of it, but I'd never heard that he also didn't rewrite it at all. I think Earl Stanley Garner did the same thing. Some people can do that, most of us can't. So for those that need to rewrite, hopefully these principles will touch all of us. Let's see, I'm kind of playing with it a little bit differently. That I think it was, Ernest Hemingway that said, writing is easy. You just sit at the keyboard until the blood begins to ooze from your pores, then you write. If we are going to write and write well, I think we need 2 things. First of all, it's transparency. That is tough. I'm kind of the solitary man that Neil Diamond sang about, that I'm a rock, I'm an island from Simon and Garfunkel. And I'm an introvert, totally. I love being alone. I love being quiet. And I don't like people to see inside me. And that hurt my writing for a long time. And one time, a very, very gifted writing friend suggested I really start to open up and share a little bit more. That is so, not just in nonfiction, but within fiction, we've got to share our heart, what we are, what values. And then I think we need to develop the craft. That is hard, hard work. I did 9 books. Then I was hired to teach at a premier private school up in Westlake Village, Oaks Christian. They're known for their football team as much as anything. But in teaching 8 years, I learned more about the craft of writing. I learned what the rules are, what makes writing fly and soar. And I learned that we ought to break them at times, but do it intentionally. So what I'm sharing now, 4 basic principles that I've taught. This is going to be part of the challenge. I've taught these at a master's level in a 9-hour class, and we're trying to do it in about an hour. So I'm going to hit the high points of it. And I trust all of you can fill in the blanks and apply it in the critique groups and what you share, continue to process with it. William Zinsser, in his book on writing well, which every author ought to have and almost memorize, on page 197, he said, remember that the 2 main virtues of writing are clarity and simplicity. And if I can kind of change the last one of simplicity, I like the term power. It's the same basic concept he describes. It's a little bit different. So we're going to look first at clarity. How many, I'm looking at, there's a lot of gray hairs. How many of you guys put together a gift for your grandkids or kids at Christmas time? Raise your hand if you did. Anybody get frustrated with the instruction manual? It seems like the map doesn't match the territory. That I finished in 2007, my second master's degree at Pepperdine in communication. And I went down and met with them and on the master's thesis. And they said all these things I had to do. And I started reading all these doctoral dissertations. And honestly, the higher up the educational ladder you go, the worse writer you become. Those are some of the most ponderous, unclear, jargon-filled pieces of writing I've ever seen. They would never get that published except in academia, and then who reads it? But I think what we've got to do is make sure we write. There was an old country preacher, J. Vernon McGee, if you ever heard him, he said, if you're going to bake cookies for the kids, put the cookie jar in a place where the kids can reach them. Our job as authors to make sure it's clear to the reader. They ought to struggle with the challenges we face with our ideas, but they shouldn't struggle with the writing that we're doing. So I heard a long time ago, probably the greatest mark of intelligence in an author is making a difficult concept clear. So we're going to look at kind of how to do that. Years ago in a speaking course, I heard someone talk about a thesis sentence. It applies to speaking and writing equally well. A thesis sentence is a 1-sentence summary of the main point you're trying to get. That applies to your book, to your article, to the chapters within it. And I suggest that unless we have a very good, clear, solid thesis sentence, or a red thread as some call it, we're not ready to write. We don't know what we're going to say, and we're going to wander all over. Very simply, the best thesis sentence is a single, simple, declarative sentence. It states something. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. I did a book, 12 Lies You Hear in Church. And the thesis sentence for the book was, let me find it over here. Misconceptions derail spiritual growth. Then every chapter had a couple of examples. Chapter 1 was titled, I Can Stay in Spiritual Kindergarten, The Truth About Spiritual Growth. The thesis, spiritual growth is a lifelong process. People, that goes all the way through it. And we need to be, let me give you another example. Like Dennis said, I'm starting to write a novel, and it's intriguing. A friend volunteered to do a lot of genealogy research, and I found more stuff about my hidden family than I ever dreamed of. And so I'm right now writing a novel. I'm 5 chapters into it. It's called Choices, The Wild Rides of the Rice Family. The thesis of the book, even though it's a novel, is our choices impact us and others. We're looking at the consequences from it. Chapter 1, the thesis is a traveling con man meets a romantic small town girl. That was my grandfather and grandmother. The second chapter, oh, by the way, that first chapter, Utah is for meeting. The second, Utah is for marrying, where that guy marries the girl. And I've got already in the first 5 chapters a thesis sentence for all of it. The way we use it is that we make sure all of the content in that section either explains it, supports it, or makes sense and lets it fly. If it doesn't do that, and this is a phrase that may be a tough thing, we've got to kill our babies. When we write something, we give life to letters that otherwise have no life on their own, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. We've got an idea, we flesh it out. It's meant to touch people. It expresses who we are and what we want to write about. But sometimes if it doesn't address it, then we need to kill that baby. I did a magazine for Discipleship Journal about 20 years ago, and I wrote the most marvelous introduction about 3 friends and I that were going to the Sierras. We're all pastoral students in seminary. And I asked the question to the guys, how important does having spiritual passion be for a minister? And the editor said, Tim, I love it, but that doesn't work because the readers of our magazine are not pastors. They're everyday people. They may be Christians, they may be starting to go to church, but they're not pastors. Your introduction doesn't work. And I realized he was totally right. So I had to kill that. But what I did, I probably shouldn't say I killed it. I put it in suspended animation for a while. I made a file, I stuck it off somewhere else. And then in a book that was talking about me and my spiritual journey, I brought it back, adapted it just a little bit, and it worked. The reason it matched the audience and the target, it was telling my story on that, and it worked. I hope that makes sense. But all of the content needs to match that red thread that ties it all together. One of the things it does, and it doesn't necessarily ever show up in the text in those words. I don't think I've ever written a thesis sentence in the same words in the book or the piece that I used for it. It may not sing, it may not be great writing, it may not be good literature, but it's the idea, the concept that everything ought to be there. What it does, it keeps us from getting sidetracked. I mean, I love rabbit trails. I was a pastor for years, and pastors are known for rabbit trails. We get an idea, we go off this way, but writers do the same thing. And I think it's, in my brief experience with the fiction, it's much easier to do that with fiction, to go off on a rabbit trail. I'm having to kill some of the stories already that my grandfather met his second wife while he was still married to his first. He was in the Army band at Fort Riley, Kansas. And the lady that's doing a lot of the research genealogy is finding all these things. She's got the entire program for Chautauqua where the band played. And I want to put all the songs in, but they're not relevant. The story there is about this traveling con man that meets another romantic small town girl and seduces her, marries her, and gets arrested the next day. So it doesn't match. I think that may be one of the most difficult things for me for self-discipline, but that red thread, that thesis sentence will help. Another way to build clarity is that we write tight. Now, if you're older, being tight used to be a term for getting drunk. I'm not saying drink like Hemingway did before you start writing. A lot of people use a lot of different things, but let me suggest use your mind instead of a substance, okay? But we need to be tight and concise, where every word needs to be there and it does its job. In one of the best movie adaptations, and Jim, I like the concept of that book, adaptations. Probably the best adaptation from a book or novel to a film was A River Runs Through It with Norman MacLean. And they put a scene in that was not in the book. MacLean signed off on it, he said that would have fit. But it was where their pastor father did their homeschooling. And the oldest son, Norman, had a job. He was writing an essay, brought it down to his dad at his dad's desk. The father looked at it, grabbed his red pen, marked it all off, handed it back to the boy and said, once more, half as long. The boy gets this frustrated look. He goes back up to his room, redoes it half the length, brings it back down to his dad. Dad reads it, marks it up in red, again says, once more, half as long. The boy goes up totally frustrated. He does the job, brings it back to the father. Father reads it, very good. Now, throw it away. The father was brilliant at teaching the son to write tight, to write concisely. A River Runs Through It, a delightful novel nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, but disqualified because it's too close to reality, ran 104 pages. But he put more content in that 104 pages than most of us could in 400. I think showing that when we write wisely and well and tight, then we'll do much, much better. Zinsser used a couple of examples. Former Chief of Staff of Richard Nixon, Alexander Haig, one time in his writing used "at this juncture of maturation." Zinsser said, "Why didn't you just say now?" What the extra words add bulk the reader has to work through. I've almost gotten too concise at times, and I know that, and I'm fighting it. Mark Twain. Well, I shouldn't say that yet. That's going to come up later. Jerry Jenkins, I don't know if you've read him. He did that famous best-selling series, Left Behind. He's done like 150 books. He knows writing. And one of the things he suggested, in order to write more concisely, if you're writing dialogue, throw out "he said" or "she said." Make sure you put cues within the dialogue where the reader can see who's talking and what it's all about without having to say, "Bob said," "Mary replied." Again, I'm a beginning novelist. I know almost nothing. I don't. I've never taken a class or workshop in novel writing whatsoever. But I've got about a page and a half of dialogue in the first chapter. As Percy, this traveling con man, in 1903, Utah, he goes to this little farming valley. True story. It's phenomenal, and we've got it all documented. It's astounding. He played a trumpet, and he would put on little musical shows and then sell patent medicines. My grandmother, Allie, was a college graduate from Utah State University. Saw her right through him. And he walks over to her after the event ends. And they had this conversation, and it went for 1.5 pages, a total of 18 different lines, without ever saying who said what. About the only thing was there, she said with a smile, because the conversation could have been taken either sarcastically or nicely, and I want to make sure that the reader got what it was. But one of the easiest ways to kind of write tight is in your conversation. Is it there? Can we cut it out and eliminate a lot of the saids? Another writers' conference I was at, Debbie Hedstrom talked about articles. And she was talking about how it's important to write as tight as you can. And I said, but Debbie, as I understand it, in articles, they pay you for words. So if they pay you per word, and if I write more words, I'll get paid more money. And she smiled and said, oh no, they won't pay you at all. So part of it is we make it tight, and that gives clarity because we're all the same idea. We don't have any extra words the readers have to wade through. So that's a quick overview. Another way to write it more tight is to, as a default setting, avoid the passive voice. I'm sure you guys all know that. The active is the preferred. It lets everybody know who's doing what to whom. Passive, sometimes you're not sure who it is. Very simply, passive is when the action is done to the subject. Active is when the action is done by the subject. Good example, passive, the boy was hit by the ball. That's passive. Or you can just say the boy was hit, but then you don't know who hit him or what hit him. If you say the boy hit the ball, the action is different in a different direction. Also, what it does, it cuts down the number of words you have to use. Passive almost always have a be verb, and often a preposition, something with by, a little phrase there. Go with the active. Now, I'm an old hippie, and we hated rules. We hated having to follow them. Our favorite phrase back then was question authority. But one of the things I discovered as I learned more about the writing rules and principles is that breaking the rules is significant. It's a good part of writing well if we know what the rules are, if we know what the purpose of them is, and if we break it for an intentional purpose. Most of the rhetorical devices that we can use, I've got a whole workshop on that. Nearly all the rhetorical devices are breaking the literary conventions, but there's a purpose behind it. Exceptions to break the rule. To me, the most powerful part in a sentence is typically the first part of it. That sets the tone for it. And if you're talking about a person, especially in fiction, and you want the focus to be on them with something that's done to them, then passive is great. For instance, true story. Percy was assaulted by the miners whom he had cheated. Passive. What is the focus on? Percy, being done to him. Active would have been the miners assaulted Percy who had cheated them. That, again, it's focus, it's knowing what you want to accomplish with that. If you want to make sure that the guilt, the responsible for the action is not on the person, then passive is a great voice to use. That's pretty much some stuff on clarity on that first part. Let's go over to the power of the second point here. Power means it's compelling. It makes the reader follow along. It pulls them in and won't let them. Have you ever start off with a book and you kind of get into it and then it just not seem to going anywhere and you set it aside and you never go back to it? That's a lack of power. We want to look at how to avoid that. Other books grab you. One of the worst books I read was Stephen King's, great author, 11/22/1963. It felt like 900 pages. Probably, to me, among King's worst writing, but the premise is what kept me going. And what would have happened if you go back and change the assassination of JFK? How would that have changed history? And King did a marvelous job exploring it, but it took way, way too long. But it had power because of the premise of the idea. I hope that makes sense. It was almost overpowered by all of the length he had within it. Now, that brings up another point. I think every good writer, if I can amplify this just a little bit, every good writer will break every rule in the book. Some can do it and get away with it. Some of us, we're not that good. Couple of tips to make your writing more powerful, though. Number one, make sure you focus on diction. Choose the right words. Mark Twain, and I've heard this a couple of versions of it, said the difference between a good word and the right word is that between a firecracker and a stick of dynamite. One of the hardest things I think we have to do as writers is to have a good, solid vocabulary and one that is functional. I've noticed this is one of my failings, one of the biggest weaknesses. I've got a really good vocabulary for reading, but with writing and speaking, I tend to use too many of the same words over and over again. Word has a really nice thing, a thesaurus that helps. We've got so many aids, especially electronically today, that usually work except Zoom. I'm thinking about writing my next book is kind of a joke parody. Live by the chip, die by the chip. So Jim, when you get Zoom figured out, let me know and we'll add this. If we ever do the book, I'll have this little thing on it. The key to making our words strong and the right ones is to, as much as we can, avoid, and this is classic, but it's hard, to avoid adjectives and adverbs and use strong nouns and verbs. Let me give you an example, two samples of the same content. Which is more powerful? The obviously drunken old man with 5 days of growth, stubble on his chin, wearing an old faded army coat and 2 other layers of clothes to keep him warm in the night, walked across the street that was littered with paper and bottles and various detritus to the other side, probably like 30 words. Or, which is stronger, the wino staggered across the alley. To me, that latter, the wino staggered across the alley encompasses, the wino puts together all of the stuff that are staggered, walked in uneasy fashion, we've got it. The alleys are typically littered, they're dirty, people drop stuff there. That's one way to tighten up our words, make them more condensed, but also with stronger. In Lincoln's second inaugural, often given as one of the greatest speeches of all time, a total of 701 words. Now, this is what gets me, and this is where the contrast with all those doctoral dissertations came in. 505 of those words had merely one syllable. 122 of them had two syllables. Out of those 701 words, only 74 had more than two syllables. Yet we often want to impress our readers that we've got a strong vocabulary, we're intelligent, we know how to use words, but sometimes we're stroking our own ego. We're not necessarily putting the audience in mind in order to make it easier for them to read. Great Gatsby, which many consider the greatest American novel of all time, and I would not argue that. What he did with the use of symbols and language was utterly astounding. Only 189 pages, pretty short for a novel. As I mentioned, A River Runs Through It, only 104. Both of these gentlemen put out novels that had a huge impact on people and lives. One of my favorite lines is, "I am haunted by waters." I've shared that so often. People resonate with that. If you like the out of doors, streams, the ocean, that line, "I am haunted by waters." I believe it's the end of River. And it moves people, it touches them, but doesn't have to be long. Another way to add power to your writing and to get more sales is focus on our leads and titles. The purpose of the kicker about a title, if you're getting for a royalty publisher, whether it's an article, short story, or a book, if you're getting paid with an advance, almost always the publisher has the right to change the title. Some of the best titles I had were kicked to the side, and I think often they did a very good job with that. But I've sold books on just the title alone. Let me give you one example. That I went to a writer's conference in 2002. I had 8 different nonfiction book proposals ready. I'd retired from my last job pastoring, and I needed to sell something. And one of them really grabbed the editor that was up there. It's called 12 Lies You Hear in Church. Quite a bit of a paradox, a little bit of a twist. She liked some others, so they decided they wanted this contract for 4 books. And they knew what 3 of them were. They weren't sure in the 4th. And we're going to kind of work at the first book was the 12 Lies You Hear in Church. That was the fulcrum. That got that written, sent it off to them. And they said, "Tim, we really like this. Can you do some more things with lies?" And one of the books was called Living Supernaturally, How to Be Filled with His Holy Spirit. And I said, "Well, I could make that." They said, "Can you make that a 12 Lies book?" And I said, "Yeah, I can do that." So, "Well, what about some others?" And I said, "Well, let me think about it." And I said, "I don't want to be known as the author of lies, another name for Satan." And they said, "Well, we'll make you the 12 Lies guy. I can buy that." So I went home and I said, "Sheila, do you want more lies books?" And she, with a smile, said, "How about 12 Lies Husbands Tell Their Wives?" And with another smile, I said, "Only if also did 12 Lies Wives Tell Their Husbands." And she said, "I don't think you'd find the material on that." I said, "That's lie number 1, women have the high moral ground." Well, that was a joke. I write Christian living stuff. I didn't write marriage counseling. I was a pastor, not a counselor. And my editor called back a few days later and said, "Tim, do you have any more ideas about lies books?" And as a joke, I told her, and she took it as a joke, those 2 titles. A couple days after that, she went to the pub committee for the publisher and said those, and they said, "Any more ideas from Tim on lies?" She said, "Those 2. And they all laughed. They all knew it was a joke. The VP of the company, who's really the executive officer of all the publishing part, said, after the laughter died down, he said, "I like those ideas. Tell you what, if he can right away just get 6 chapter titles for each of those 2 books, we'll buy those 2." And that made it a 5th book. People, I sold 2 books on just the title. That grabbed them. Ironically, those 2 books are the best-selling ones I've ever had. They came out in 2004. I went through several publications that have been published in like 8 different languages. And in 2020, I was still getting royalties from it. And I am a no-name. I'm not one of the top shelf A authors. Nobody knows me. In my entire writing career, only one time if someone said, oh, I've read your book. We were checking in at Palm Desert to timeshare. Young guy, about 20 years old, said, excuse me, didn't you write a book about God or something? I mean, I'm a nobody. But when we have a good title that'll grab people, that's something, one will sell the editor. They know we're creative. They know we've got a way of reaching people. And even if they change it, it grabs them. Because a title can sell a book or multiple books as we go into it. Most of the stories I've got are, I know that this is not a Christian group, but I was a pastor. Most of my writing has been Christian. So the examples are that. A friend of mine was looking at a book about God, and she looked at two of them. One, Parables for a title. The other was an autobiography of God. That latter, to me, it just jumped out. The concept of an autobiography for God is phenomenal. She sold that book, tried it with Parables, and it didn't work. Let me give you a couple of examples. No, I don't have that down. Never mind. There's a humorist author, Dave Muir, and he's does a phenomenal job with titles, and just from the title, you know that it's going to be humorous. Stark Raving Dad. A nice takeoff. Or the days, D-A-Z-E, of our wives. What I suggest, look at the top selling books by no-name authors, those that aren't big, that are going to sell just by their name. Look at the titles, spend some time doing some research, especially the books that are the kind of thing that are similar to yours. What works in a title that sells the book when the author's name isn't big? I think if we get let me give you a couple of tips. I almost skipped this. A couple of tips on titles. Number one, let them be brief. So often, what I've heard from editors, 5 words or less for the title. You can beef that up with a subtitle, but make sure it's brief. And like with Dave Muir, The Days of Our Wives, make sure it matches the content, that it gives the people a clue on the slant you're going to take. Another one, let it be specific. One of the books I did was, and someone suggested how to get closer to God, which it's kind of blah. Someone else suggested, actually the editor did, and that's what when we went, a passionate pursuit of God. It's much more specific, gives the reader an idea of what's happening. Let it be something that grabs attention. That in the, for those of us in my generation, 11/22/63, you right away you link that to the Kennedy assassination. That grabbed me at the title. Let's go to leads. A lead is a way that you grab the readers. The opening, we just heard a speech, about a 50 minute speech a couple of days, about a week or two ago. And the introduction was 20 minutes rambling about how the guy played football. And it just didn't match. I would all recommend to be there. We were there, but it was a waste of time. If I could have, I would have left because the lead was too long. I realized today, especially in speaking, but I think sometimes in books, we get into stories, they become much, much too long. We need to let the lead be long enough to grab them, give an idea of what's coming, and then we kind of play with it. 5 types of leads I found work really good, especially today, a narrative where you tell a story. I grew up with nonfiction books that were heavy and dense. They were thick, a lot of data, facts, knowledge, reasoning, and I like that. That I guess it feeds my bent. But back in Vietnam with the new journalism, we started going to story. The author became more involved in it. And now, as a pastor, we started off, the best thing 40 years ago was to tell a joke. You don't tell jokes anymore. That just doesn't work with audiences. But you grab something like a narrative that begins, especially with millennials, the younger generation, in a postmodern age, story rules. Story is phenomenal. And I think especially with when you're doing with Sierras, or excuse me, I looked over my notes. If you're dealing with nonfiction, narrative nonfiction is one of the bigger things almost in all of the nonfiction I write now. It opens with a story of some kind. People want to hear about people, their life experience, but it's got not just be a story to tell a story that'll relate to the point you're trying to make. One of my best leads was started off with my dad. Dad was a trout fisherman, supreme. And one of the stories was of a nonfiction chapter. My dad was both my best friend and my biggest rival, especially when it came to trout fishing. To me, that worked. It pulled a lot of people in. Another way to start with a lead is you have a theme. It's a thematic thing. You start with the thesis, the idea. It can be as a question. We'll skip that for right now. Let's explore why God allowed the Capitol to be invaded. Why did God allow that to happen in democracy? One of the best things we have. A question will get people, or the thematic statement will let them know right away what you're addressing. Hopefully that's going to tie into a felt need. A quote is another great way to start off. Love Mark Twain. I mean, this guy understood writing in a way that most of us can't begin to comprehend. If you want to read some fascinating books, he's got a 3-volume biography. Each of the books about this thick. It's awesome. But one of my favorite quotes by Twain: whenever I feel a need to exercise, I lay down until it passes. Quotes are good. If the person is known, that's good, but make sure it's relevant. Question: why did I ever ask her to marry me? That'll get people wondering. And a shocking statement. I read a book by a pastor. It opened with, I don't believe in God. And once more, it pulls you in and it's got you there. Okay. I was about to say, if you guys have any questions at this point, we'll hold those for the end. Let's go to the third principle of excellent writing, and that is to use imagery. I think imagery does more to elevate the caliber of our writing, to give a literary flair to it, and also make the reading much easier than anything else. Imagery basically helps the reader see it. It speaks more to more of the senses involved. And the more senses we can involve, then the more effective the reader will be touched. Imagery can explain something better. We'll look at some of the ways to do it than just the straight words will be. It can use fewer words to explain it because they can see the picture and they see the length. Let me give you an example. These are about 12. This is on the handout. One of the handouts you've got, it'll say imagery and figurative language. The types of them. First would be a metaphor, where you compare two things that share something common. Typically, one that the reader knows and one that the reader does not know. What that does with a metaphor or a simile, we'll put them together there for discussion. It takes this thing that's known, and if they know why you're comparing them, they've got it right away. Cute little thing, totally irrelevant. One of my favorite metaphor uses on an English professor's office door at Azusa Pacific is the line, "Metaphors be with you." Cool little thing. Personification gives human traits to something that is not. The motorcycle howled with joy climbing the mountain. Did they howl? No. But it gives you a picture, and once more, it brings more images in. There, the image was that, or the sense was that of hearing. The growl of the V8 thrilled my soul. Metonymy is another great way to save on words and do pictures. I think, let me back up a little bit. One of the benefits of imagery and figurative language is that it makes the reader think a little bit more. Rather than laying it all out, you make them start to think, to go below the surface. Old rock song, you got to lay it between the lines, and figurative language can do that. A metonymy is where the part stands for the whole. For instance, the crown owns this land, or this belongs to the king. The crown doesn't actually own it, but it is metonymy then. A symbol, it's something that represents something else. If you recall The Great Gatsby, there's the line about where Gatsby was looking across the bay, that they're on two little peninsulas. He was on one, Daisy, the love of his life, on the other. And they had a boat dock at Daisy's, and there was a green light there. And he used, I think, the orgasmic green light. What does green light stand for? Go. And every time he saw that, he was thinking, yeah, I've got to go and try and recapture Daisy. Beautiful use of a symbol. Don't have to say a whole lot, but when it recurs a couple of times, the readers will pick that up. Allegory is an extended narrative with multiple lessons. It's similar to a parable. A parable is a short story with one basic point. An allegory, Pilgrim's Progress would be a great example of the allegory. And one of my favorite is the paradox of two truths that are opposing, they're also both true. And oxymoron's that same thing in two words. The classic is jumbo shrimp. The two don't quite match. And when you can do that, it grabs the reader's attention and it makes them start to ponder and think a little bit more. Overstatement, where we intentionally state more than is actual. One of my favorite lines on that is, I've told you a million times not to exaggerate. Understatement, where you intentionally state less than it's actual. It's the cool thing. It's a way of saying I've actually done more. I've never ridden a motorcycle, and I've got 250,000 miles on it. So play with that. And then irony, you've got verbal, dramatic, and situational, where there's an incongruity between the actual and the normal, or what is expected. How are we doing on time? Let me skip that. Well, okay, let me give it a use of imagery that worked very well in one of the books, on the book 12 Lies Here About the Holy Spirit. The book was about being filled with the Spirit. And from the Christian perspective, one of the symbols of the Spirit is fire. And so I thought I would play with that. And one of the chapters was called Let It Burn. And I used the example of the Yellowstone fire back in the 1980s or so. That was, you don't quench the Spirit. Another was step into the flames, and every one of these had a story to start with it. That was ask for the Spirit. To be holy is purified by fire. Feed the fire, steps in how to get filled. Follow the flames, let the Spirit guide you. I was amazed at that metaphor. There was a lady that worked with me on that, an editor, that was delightful. And I started with that. And she said, I looked at Tim and I didn't think that metaphor would work on a continued basis, but it worked all the way through. It gave unity to that whole chapter of using some imagery that worked for every one of the subpoints, okay? And I think you guys have that. Let's go on to the last one, and they'll have some time for some questions. I said earlier that we write for one of two reasons, for therapy or for impact. If we want to write to touch others, and that can be with a novel, nonfiction, short, long, I think we're past the stage of writing for ourselves. That's a journal. You don't need to be in a group to learn about writing for yourself. But if we're going to write for others, then we need to be aware of the audience. There's a communication theorist named Engel, gave a quote that has changed how I communicate. The audience is sovereign. And by that, he's saying the audience rules. The classic thing I learned in writing books for publication, and we don't have brick and mortar stores too often anymore, but the process was when a person walks in a bookstore and looks at a book, most of them are spine out, and you look for what catches your attention. Is it colorful? You look for the title. If the title grabs your attention, you'll go on. You look for the author's name at the bottom. And if that's good, you pull it out, look at the cover, look at the back cover, and start going through. If nothing there touches the potential reader, if it's not something that grabs his attention, that touches a felt need, he's going to put it back and we're not going to get the sale. So our job as writers to impact readers is to make sure they get our product and that we present it in a way that they're apt to say, I need this. One of the things I would suggest is doesn't mean we compromise our values and our ideals, but we're talking about how do we best present it to the audience. I don't know if you guys remember a couple of years ago when Bill Graham, they had that big biography toward the end of his life, kind of an autobiography that was written by others. And in all the Christian bookstores, it showed Billy Graham with a coat and tie on. Then I went to Barnes and Noble. I looked for the same book. It had Billy Graham with a denim shirt on. Why? Go back 30 years, a lot of the Christians would expect people and respect them more if they had a coat and tie on. You expect that from a pastor, for an evangelist like Billy Graham. You go to the general market, and it's much more approachable as an everyday guy. Two different pictures based upon two different audiences. Same Billy Graham, same text and everything. Let me give two reasons why we need to focus on it. One, when we focus on the audience, then we have the chance to get it published. If we're writing and venting our spleen at what's gone on in our life, not many people are going to buy it. But an editor, if we're presenting needs that they have, they will. But it'll also help the audience to grow and change and ponder things in their life. How could somebody read The Great Gatsby and not wonder about the obsession with materialism and success that we have in America? He was effective because he told a story that everybody could relate to. If we have time, I'll try and go over, you've got a handout on the level of dispute. Let's see how much time we have after that. But there are a couple of ways that we can get our audience aware of it. Paul the Apostle wrote over half of the New Testament books, the books that have changed the course of human history. Paul was one of the most marvelous writers in that he wrote with an audience orientation. He quoted the literature of the people he's writing to. In the book of Acts, as some of your poets have said, we are his offspring. And he took that quote from the culture and then applied it for the message he had. Paul another time said, to the Jews, I became like a Jew. To the Gentiles, I became like a Gentile. The principle is we need to identify with our readers, whatever. This is not a religious thing whatsoever. Rather, we've got to be able to identify with the reader. Do we have our reader picked out? With most in the nonfiction world particularly, this may be true in the novel world, you guys could tell me about that. When you put a proposal together, the agent I had three target audiences. They had the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary. We need to know who our audience is and choose our words based upon words of them. Make sure we realize what they believe. We may want to change their beliefs. We got to know where they are. So 4 things we can do to quickly analyze the audience. What are their beliefs? Where do they agree or disagree with us? One of the things I learned from Heinlein, this is back in junior high, my English teacher in 7th grade said, who do you like to read? I said, I love Robert Heinlein's stories. He's a great storyteller, and he was. He did great juvenile fiction, and in junior high, I was starting to read some of the adult stuff too. He said, are you aware of Heinlein's worldview that he's trying to get across? I said, no, he's just writing stories. And then I started reading with that in mind, and I realized my English teacher in junior high was correct. He had a worldview, and if we're to be effective readers, we need to look at what the author's values are. The words are in the top level, but you go underground are the values of the author. And we've got to realize the same way, what are the values for our audience? that we could use, play off of, take advantage in a good sense. And the level of dispute, we'll look at it. And I think we need to acknowledge our differences, that it's, again, depending on how overt or covert we want to be. Nonfiction, you can be much more overt. Fiction, you often hide things in between the lines, but realize they have different beliefs, respect them for that. Build on the commonalities. What do we share? We may have these beliefs different, but what do we have in common? Also, if we've got differing beliefs, one of the things I found that works phenomenally well is we reason inductively, not deductively. Deductively is where we have a general principle we all agree to, then you give application. Inductive, we use example after example after example, and then we start to reach a conclusion. Let them work with you in the reasoning process. That, again, I'm finding I'm doing that. I'm not telling the readers in this book I've started that Percy is a scoundrel, but he's selling patent medicines and lying. He abandons his wife as soon as he finds out she's pregnant. Well, he's still married to her. He marries another girl. I don't have to tell the readers he's bad. They can think for themselves and see that. Also, aim for small gains. I wanted to hire an agent at one point, and this is back when it was agents weren't always needed and some publishers resisted them. And his line was, Tim, I want the whole enchilada. And I was saying, Steve, what if I give you one taco first? And we're trying to figure out how much to represent me. But often in life, we need to go for small gains. Don't try and convert a person totally over. Just let them understand. Go step by step. Also be aware of their culture. Culture is not ethnicity. Culture is the beliefs and values and practices of one group of people that are taught. That you can look at any ethnic group, they'll have a variety of cultures within that, socioeconomic, educational level and all. So be aware of the cultural differences. Look at the ages. That it's hard, we can, how do I phrase this? We can probably best understand or communicate with cultures. We have an understanding of where they are. We've got all the breakdown of cultures today that are generalities, the greatest generation, the silent, the boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. They often share traits, and we need to know that. One of the book proposals I've got up now for nonfiction is primarily focused on those 30 on down. Totally different group than the ones I've reached before. So we'll see how that goes. I don't know. Also be aware of the gender differences. It's not that we're opposite, but it's probably like on a continuum. There's overlap, but a lot of differences, and be aware of that. Well, we are we've hit the high points of all of that. If you guys would like, I can give you the fill-in on the level of dispute, or we can just open up for questions. Your call. So Dennis, if you can unmute.
Yeah, I'll just say, you may want to go through the level of dispute. You have a few more minutes here and give us the fill in the blanks, unless I have other input.
Okay, let me do that really quickly. If you look at the level of dispute, there's a line. Level of dispute refers to, does your audience agree with you? That is below the line. Do they disagree with you? And that's above the line. A claim is your thesis sentence. It's what you want them to believe. That's the C in the upper box. The bottom box is evidence. That is evidence that they already agree with you on. By the way, guys, if you ever write anything nonfiction persuasive, this is the best tool I've ever seen. Then there's a little arrow going off to the right that says R, that is reasoning. That is the way that you connect the evidence to the claim. Jefferson said some truths are self-evident. That was a common concept in the culture with the Enlightenment that had gone on, but most of the time, not all truths and facts are self-evident, and we need to support it. There's another thing on the very bottom. Okay, the claim, if you go down, claim, what we wish the audience to accept, E, evidence, then the claim, level of dispute, reasoning, or what do they call that? The warrant, It's how we use and arrange evidence. Then the last C is chaining. Guys, this is marvelous. Chaining, it's when we establish a claim, when the audience comes to accept that claim. Then what does that claim become? Evidence. And we move the line up, and what once was a claim now is evidence. The line has gone up, we've got another claim, establish that, and we move the line. That is a part of often when we talk about getting it in small bites, go step by step by step. Then the next page, there's 5 primary types of reasoning, and they vary based upon your audience and your subject matter. The first is deductive, that reasons from a general principle to specific application. Then inductive, we talked about that. That ranges from specific examples that the audience accepts to a general principle. Abductive is one of the most effective today. It's basically conversation. You get people involved in conversation and bring it to a group conclusion. Narrative, you tell a story. Narrative is especially good to get people in. It doesn't always prove it, but it explains it and understands it. And then the last is analogy, where you use a similar situation example to establish, explain, or to prove a claim. Okay, other questions? Is that anything, any of the questions on the level of dispute?
I have a question about that.
Yes.
Since we had to go through.
Hold on a minute. Hold on.
Anyway, so I was saying that I was wondering if I could read more about this somewhere. Tim, do you have this explained in more detail somewhere, the level of dispute?
It's in an advanced communication book. Let me look. It is. Oh, let me write it down. I'll get the book for you. And I can get that to Dennis or to Jim.
Okay.
It's one of the.
That's okay. I just wanted to ask quickly because there's a lot here and it looks good. So
it's this is one of the best tools for persuasion, whether subtle or clear, that I've ever seen. I wish I'd come up with it.
Well, thank you.
Yes. I did add the reasoning types to it. That wasn't the initial thing. That was from another source, but I'll try.
I have a question on where you started with the last 2 lines on the first page, reasoning, or I missed that the rest of the sentence, and I missed the sentence below the last sentence in that paragraph. The new
on the level of dispute.
Yes.
Okay, let me go over all of those again. With the sentences, the first is claim. The second is evidence. And then the next blank in that sentence is claim. What we use to support the claim the audience does agree with. Next is level of dispute. The next sentence is reasoning or the warrant. In logic and argumentation, reasoning and warrant are interchangeable. Some sources use one, some use the other. Reasoning or the warrant, how we use and arrange evidence to support our claim. And the last is chaining, chaining. When we establish a claim, then the level of dispute moves up to transform the previous claim into evidence. The new evidence, the previous claim, can then be used to establish another claim. If you guys ever wanted, we could do another where we just a workshop on this, where we do some stuff in small groups. If you guys like to, so there's a lot here. I know that.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
I have a couple of comments. I really enjoyed your talk, Tim. It's terrific. I just wondered, have you seen this book called Nick?
No.
It's about the Nick before Great Gatsby by a guy. One review I read of it just came out. It's brand new. Michael Ferris Smith. People in the Diamond Valley Writers Guild are tired of me talking about Great Gatsby.
It really shows your wisdom.
So I keep trying to tell them it's one of the greatest of all American novels. Nobody seems to want to agree with me. 11/22/63. I was in Dallas that day. But
Wow.
beyond that, that's the only one of Stephen King's books to make the best list of the year for New York Times and LA Times.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. It's not, it's long. I didn't mind it so much, but it is long, and it probably could have been cut down some, but I did enjoy it. It's a fun read. And one thing about Hemingway and irony, he said that there can be no fiction without irony. Now, I think I've come to believe that. So that's just a little sidelight about your talk. Just a couple of things about it, but I really enjoyed it. I don't have any questions. I want to make those comments, so I'm going to mute myself now and get out of your way.
Hey, Jim, quickly, what was the author of Nick?
Jim, did you hear that? We want to know the author of Nick.
Yeah. It's his name is Michael Ferris Smith, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for a book called A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain.
Mm.
And so this is not a man. No, wait, that's the wrong one. That's the guy who's quoting him. Sorry, no. He's written some other books that are listed here. The one review I read of it was very complimentary. The one thing I will say about it, those of you who are familiar with Gatsby know that Nick narrates the story in his first person. This one is a third person approach. So I found that a little bit different. I haven't read the whole book. I just started it. It is the third person approach. Now, does that in some way invalidate his attempt? Because I think I went in expecting a first person. And the first chapter I read is the only one I've read so far, which was interesting. I'm going to give it a try, of course, but yeah, it's not Fitzgerald and it's not The Great Gatsby, but it's an interesting take.
You know, as a quick thing, I was offended at the most recent movie, Gatsby with DiCaprio, where Nick is in the book, he's the only halfway sane person. And here he's in a mental hospital explaining what went on.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, if somebody wants to unmute themselves.
Okay.
I had a question. I just asked, and it has to do with leads and titles. Today, memes are big things. Do you have any suggestions on how to come up with these snappy phrases and things like that?
You know, I learned to write by reading a lot. And it wasn't until I went and taught at that last school where I learned a lot of the principles of it. So snappy leads and titles, I think in part there's a gift to it. I think some people think that way, some don't. Otherwise, like I said, look at the books in your genre and what is being done. What are some things? Look for the principles that make a good lead, good title. Does that make sense? I shared some things. I don't know that I can add to that, Dennis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions?
Howard.
Yes, I enjoyed your talk immensely. It was very enlightening and had a lot of reasoning behind it. One of the things that I've come to believe is that in fiction, there's an emotion present that the author provides. And while I appreciated all of your points, they seem more based on logic. And so there's an indefinite or undefined quality in fiction that I believe the author brings to it that doesn't depend on any kind of formula, although all the things that you've mentioned are very useful and a good writer should employ them. But there's something else that can't be defined. What do you think of that?
I would tend to agree, Howard. I think that the purpose of this was like 4 principles that apply to all types of writing.
Mhm.
I would say, though, the writer ought to bring emotion into everything, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. If you don't, as a general rule, and I'll share an exception, as a general rule, if you don't really feel that if you don't really feel something and have a passion for it, your writing will be blah. And I think that's part of, and the exception would be, I hated writing those 2 books about 12 lies husbands and wives tells. Marriage counseling is not my forte. I hated writing every bit of it. I had no passion for it. I just had the passion to fill the contract. I think there's an X factor in writing that maybe what you're talking about. Emotion could be a part of it. It's some people have a knack for writing. They can just do it and it's there. Others of us have to learn how to do it. And it's as we learn the conventions of writing that we can say it better. But I would hope we would always bring emotion to the book as a default. I would.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And again, I'm really good at novel writing. I've written 5 chapters of a novel, and that's it. So I would not consider myself an expert on that part of it.
Thank you for joining us, Tim. We really appreciate your contribution.
Thank you. It's an
Absolutely.
honor. It's good to be with you.
Does anybody else have any other questions you'll ask Tim before we go? Well,
No questions, but don't forget about next month's program.
yes, next month's program. Who has, Michelle, is that your person?
Yes.
Yes, that's what I thought. I'm glad you pointed that out. All right, who's up for next month?
Well, is there anyone else who has questions though for Tim before I launch into that? No?
I'd like to
Okay.
thank
Wait,
him.
Karen Robertson has a question.
I was just going to ask him, do we know how to get a hold of Tim if we want to get in touch?
Easiest is the email. It's Tim Riter, TIMRITER at AOL.com. Means I'm an old guy.
Tim, can you stick that in the chat?
Thank you.
Okay, tell me how to do it and I'd be glad to.
Down at the bottom of the screen, you click
the
on
bottom?
chat. It brings up the ongoing chat between the members.
Okay.
I'll do it.
Yeah, and Lynn, you can put that on
it's going.
on the website too, right?
Okay, yes, I can.
Okay.
Okay, it is there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good thinking
so
on your
real quick,
feet.
If there aren't any more questions, I'll launch into this. If not, one more. Is there any more questions?
Round of applause, everybody.
Hey, yeah.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right. Okay, Michelle.
Oh,
I have
we
a
have-
question.
Oh, Daniel has a question.
Yeah, just a quick one. Tim, is Riter the name you were born with?
Yes. It's destiny.
Coincidence.
Now, a friend of mine is an oral surgeon named Dr. David Cutts. So those things happen. I tell people I've been a writer 100% of my life before I knew how to write.
Okay, first off, one more shameless plug for membership. I did put the PO box once again into the chat. If anyone wants it, it's 1154, PO Box 1154, Hemet 92546. Anyway, so next month's speaker is an amazing speaker. Some of us have had the opportunity to hear her before. Her name is Fawzia Burke, and she is the owner of FSB Associates, which is basically an author's publicity firm. She also is co-founder of PubSite Pro, which some of you know is the only website server company who is exclusively for authors for marketing books. Anyway, she'll be with us next week. Her topic is going to be the 3-step formula for building an author platform. She is the author of Online Marketing for Busy Authors, is the founder, as I said, of those 2 companies. And she's a consultant and coach for authors who need help navigating the book marketing and publicity landscape. Before starting FSB, she worked for Henry Holt and John Wiley. Fawzia has promoted books for authors such as Alan Alda, Ariana Huffington, Deepak Chopra, Melissa Francis, S.C. Gwynn, and Mika, I cannot say that word, Brzezinski, Charles Spencer, and many more. She is based in San Diego. Dynamic speaker. I think Dennis has heard her speak before, and I think it's a timely topic for a lot of our members who are launching books or have just recently launched books. I see Lynn nodding. We had this conversation this week, actually. She and I was on the phone with her for 45 minutes last night. She's an amazing woman, and I think she's going to be a great speaker. So once again, Fawzia Burke, she's amazing. Oh, by the way, she is the woman who created the very first author website ever, and it was for Sue Crafton. So the very first website ever to go live for an author in the internet back in whatever the 80s or 90s. This is the lady who put her on the internet. So she knows her stuff.
You want to hold up? You want to hold up? Oh, I was going to say we want to make sure that the date is accurate. It is going to be the 27th. Is that correct? No, let's see. Yeah, of February, 27th of February.
4th, it's always the 4th Saturday.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, you'll get me the flyer there, Michelle.
Yeah, sure.
Dennis, I want to thank Dennis for helping us with the problem today. I'm sorry he and I didn't get it fixed. We tried. We thought it was fixed, but I guess not. At any rate, thanks a lot, and I appreciate everybody joining us today. And until then, I guess it's next week. And once again, Tim,
next month.
Enjoyed your presentation. Yeah.
Next month.
Next month. Yes. Not next week.
Hey, Vicky.
Next month. Sorry about that. Next month.
Vicky, how's Daisy?
She's doing great.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much. You can close the meeting for us, Dennis, I guess. All right. Bye, everybody.
Have a great vacation here.
Bye.
Bye, Dennis. Bye, Tim. Bye.